On behalf of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, welcome to our webinar, part of a series related to our publication, Zionism, an Indigenous Struggle. My name is Nathan Elberg, one of the co-editors of the book. This evening's webinar focuses on the use of education as a weapon to destroy cultures. Our partners this evening are Congregation Beth Zion and the Indigenous Coalition for Israel. In contemporary Western society, many educators work to strip children of their religion by teaching values hostile to traditional Western culture. Parents who object are labeled a threat. In some jurisdictions, authorities have even enlisted the police to help impose the desired cultural shift. So far, there hasn't been much violence. Hopefully, there won't be. This isn't always the case when education is used as a weapon. We tend to think of schooling as a good thing, meant to enable children to make their way through the world. We ascribe noble motives to educators, which is usually the case. But the noble intentions may be quite sinister to the students. Imperceptible differences in seeing the world may have profound cultural implications. Throw in 25 years of military conscription, forcibly transporting a child thousands of miles from his family, starvation, freezing, and sexual abuse of helpless children, you're doing more than modifying a culture. You're destroying the future of a society. Any supposed noble intentions become irrelevant here. In North America, the goal was supposed to be to modernize the natives, to allow them to earn a living. In Tsarist Russia, the army was considered the best education. The goal of the Cantonist program was to modernize the Jews, to integrate them into society by making them good Christian soldiers. Both programs had supposed noble intentions, brutal execution, and horrific consequences. The Native American residential schools have recently been spotlighted by the press and politicians. For example, the Canadian House of Commons recently passed a motion in favor of declaring the residential schools as genocide. Government responses make you wonder whether they are interested in the well-being of the victims, or rather, on scoring political brownie points. Our panelists this evening will discuss the social, political, and cultural values that could lead to the establishment of such horrific programs. Were the Jewish and Native American children considered fully human, created in the image of God, so to speak? In his article, Jews, Conversos, and Native Americans in our book, Rabbi Jose Fauer documented how Spanish conquistadors did not consider the natives they tortured to be fully human. Did Canadian and US policymakers hold similar views of their indigenous populations? Was education ever really the goal? Or rather, was it to dissolve a people in order to appropriate their assets, be they land or knowledge? Was there any benefit to the students? Could the program have succeeded without destroying the culture of the children? Or were the supposed noble intentions themselves a destructive force? Our panelists addressing these questions this evening are Ryan Belrose and Ira Robinson. Ryan Belrose is a Native American Métis activist from Northern Alberta. He founded Canadians for Accountability, a Native rights advocacy group. He's been active with many organizations, including B'nai B'rith, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, and Indigenous Bridges, among others. He is a sought-after speaker and author who has established a large following. Ira Robinson is Professor Emeritus, Jewish Studies, with the Department of Religions and Cultures of Concordia University, Montreal. He is the Associate Director of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, a member of its academic council, and has published many articles on Jewish religion History, and Anti-Semitism. Our moderator tonight is Barbara Kay, a nationally known political columnist for the National Post and other media. Her articles are highly respected for their ability to concisely address the heart of any issue she is discussing. Our panelists will begin by taking about 10 minutes each to explain what the residential school and Cantonist programs were. Although the former has become infamous in recent years, there is a great deal of information. The Cantonist program dates back to the 19th century and is mostly unknown. After these brief explanations, the panelists will have a conversation about the two programs. We're not presenting a suffering competition as to which was worse, but rather examining their commonalities, causes, and how best to respond. This part of the program will take approximately half an hour, followed by a brief question period. Please post all your questions in the comments section. We will address as many as possible. Thank you for joining us. I now turn the floor over to our moderator and panelists.
Thank you, Nathan. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to moderate what I know will be a high-level and informative discussion on an issue that is very present in the news cycle, and therefore much on the minds of Canadians. Sorry, my teleprompter isn't moving. I'm happy to say that I've enjoyed a long-standing collegial friendship with both Ira and Ryan. I consider both of them my teachers as well. Until I ran across Ryan's writing, I had never really understood that Jews, even white Jews of Ashkenazi heritage, meet the criteria for indigeneity. That was quite pivotal to my thinking about the nature of indigeneity in general, and sparked an interest in the subject that continues to exert a strong hold on my attention. Diego, the book cover. Therefore, 2 years ago, I was pleased to read and eager to review the book Nathan Elberg co-edited with Machla Abramovitz, Zionism, an Indigenous Struggle, Aboriginal Americans and the Jewish State. All three of our participants are represented in this book, which I recommend highly for its fine scholarship, uniformly high intelligence, varied points of view, and as well a panoply of unusual insights. Nathan's essay, Simple Truths, a Cree Indian explains a 2,000-year-old rabbinic teaching, is a fond and very touching recollection of his relationship with Bobby Visitor, a Cree Indian living in the small community of Wemindji, whom he met when he, Elberg, was a young anthropologist visiting the Quebec coast of James Bay while doing research on Quebec's great hydroelectric project on that territory. Ryan's entry in this anthology took the form of a dialogue between himself and a fellow Indian who has drunk the Palestinians as Indigenous brothers' Kool-Aid. Belrose's friendly persuasion and well-honed arguments tease out acknowledgement that Ryan's logic is unassailable. It is the Jews Canada's Indigenous peoples should be rooting for. And in his contribution, Ira Robertson recalled a sad chapter in Indigenous Jewish relations with his analysis of the Ahenakew affair, the story of Canadian First Nations leader David Ahenekew's fall from social grace and its legal fallout in 2002 through expression of crudely expressed extreme anti-Semitism. In his deeply researched account, Ira set out the difficulties of dealing with prejudice against Jews in general through the court system. What all the writers in this excellent compendium have in common is that each and every one of them resists the siren call of victimhood. As one of the contributors, Jay Corwin, puts it, while the victim is pitied, he may never be equal, and for him to ask for or demand equality means the end of victimhood. So now, on with the program. I'll turn the floor now over to Ira Robinson.
Thank you, Barbara. This is a program that touches history, but more importantly, it touches historical memory. Historical memory is what happens that people remember and stays on their minds. And it's very, very safe to say that residential schools will loom large in the historical memory, not merely of Canadian First Nations, but of all Canadians. It has become a really important factor and should, going forward, remain a large factor as people remember. Now, historical memory, as I said, is distinct from history because it may be proven that something happens a little differently than in the historical memory, but that does not disturb historical memory. Jews also have a historical memory. Canadian Jews, mostly, not entirely, come from ancestors in Eastern Europe. And what happened to Jews in Russia between the 18th and the 21st centuries matters. And once again, you can write history with all the sources, but there is also historical memory, and looming large in the Jewish historical memory is the story of the Cantonists. It's a story of a Russian government through its military that takes young Jewish boys between as young as 8 years old and takes them away from their parents, away from their towns, to military style schools where they prepare to enter the military. And once again, there are many historical aspects to this, and there is historical documentation of it, but the historical memory of this remains not merely with Russian Jews or with Jews stemming from Eastern Europe. It extends to most historically conscious Jews in the world today. So I'm going to say a couple of things about the Cantonists, both in terms of the extant historical evidence, because there are reams of reports in the Russian archives that have been unearthed in the last number of years that talk about these boys and what happened to them. And then, as I said, there is the historical memory. They came and took our children. This is the Jewish historical memory. Now, what was the program all about? Well, it comes from the mind of Tsar Nicholas I, Nikolai, who reigned in the first half of the 19th century over the Russian Empire. And he had two contradictory desires. On the one hand, he wanted to modernize Russia the way that France had modernized, or Germany, or Austria. On the other hand, he wanted Russia to remain his state where his word was law. He wanted to remain an absolute autocrat, and he wanted the Russian Orthodox Church to reign supreme. And what happened with the Cantonists is a mixture of Nicholas's desire to modernize Russia and his desire to maintain Orthodox Christianity as top. Modernizing. In France, in the late 18th century, in Austria, in the late 18th, early 19th century, there were movements to make Jewish citizens more useful to the state. And one of the means by which Jewish citizens were going to be made more useful to the state was to integrate them into the armed services. And the result of this was going to be we, the French, we, the Austrians, are going to integrate you Jews into the military, and in return, we're going to give you rights. In France, we are going to give you citizenship rights. So, Nicholas got the part where we are going to integrate Jews into the military. He didn't get the part which said, and in return, we're going to give the Jews rights. On the contrary, Nicholas wanted to keep Jews in restriction. They were restricted, Jews. They were, generally speaking, restricted to the westernmost provinces of the Russian Empire: Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and the Ukraine, and not allow Jews to go anywhere else in Russia. And he restricted their means of making a living, causing widespread poverty. But he wanted to emulate the integration of Jews to the army. The Russian army under Nicholas was not a place anybody wanted to be in. Russian peasants wanted anything but to give their sons to the army, because once you get in the army, your term of service initially was 25 years. So if you start at 18 and you're 43 when you get out, and given the life expectancy of the time, 43 was about all you got. So this was a prison and a life sentence for Christian peasants. And it was an absolute disaster for Jews, because not merely was it a life sentence, but it meant that these Jews would be taken out of their communities and subjected to the likelihood that they would have to abandon part or even all of their religious observances. But it got even worse, if you will, because the logic of the situation was that 18-year-olds and above often were married with families or taxpayers. You did not want to send these people away, so you sent away not merely Jews, but Russian Orthodox peasants as well. You sent away children, as I said, as young as 8. And these children were usually the children of the poor, because rich parents had means to bribe, and bribery was ubiquitous in Russia of that day. So it was the children of the poor who went. They were taken from their communities, and they were ultimately placed in military schools. Now, a large question was Christianity forced on these children? And the answer is not an unanimous yes or no. It's very complex, because on the one hand, Tsar Nicholas himself pushed hard to have these military schools Christianize the Jewish children. But statistically, from the documentation we have, most children resisted Christianization. From 1827, when the draft included Jews, through the middle of the 1870s, there were something like 15,000 baptisms of Jewish children, and there were many more Jewish children than that. Those children who resisted largely because they were supported by Jewish soldiers in the Russian army. And here's something very interesting. Tsar Nicholas wanted the children baptized, but when adult Jews were in the Russian army, they had the legal right to remain Jewish. And indeed, the Russian army often, not always, but often gave them help in creating a Jewish religious life within the Russian army. So Russian army soldiers could encourage and strengthen some of these boys. So now, the fact is that these schools were, from our perspective, quite brutal. Physical coercion was ordinary in the 19th century. People in authority got to beat up the people under their authority. Ship's captains could flog sailors. Husbands were legally allowed, within limits, to beat their wives. It's no surprise that these kids got beaten on a regular basis. And when boys got beaten, most people looking on said, well, serves them right, doesn't it? So the conditions were objectively brutal. But there was the other hand was that beyond the brutal conditions, they also got educated. They were educated in Russian. Now, were there rules that you got beat up if you spoke Yiddish in the barracks? I have no record of that, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised. But these boys learned Russian. They learned to read and write Russian. They learned math. Some of them learned actual skills in these schools because the Russian army needed skilled people. They needed blacksmiths. They needed musicians for military bands. And in the various Cantonist schools, which were not merely for Jewish children, they were for a number of other categories of children. Through the brutality, those who survived and those who survived their term of service in the Russian army after they got to 18, which initially was 25 years and then it was commuted to 15 years. In any event, once these people left the army, they should live so long, they did ultimately get one important right that other Russian Jewish subjects never got. They got the right to reside wherever in Russia they pleased. And the roots of Jewish communities inside Russia and in places like Siberia come from former Jewish soldiers. It's a complex story, but one, as I said, that lives and will live in Jewish historical memory. Barbara, unmute.
I knew I'd forget. Sorry. Thank you, Ira. Ryan, you're up.
Hi. So I guess one of the reasons that the residential schools have kind of come into the forefront is that everybody's looking for reasons to be offended and reasons to be angry, and they're talking about why we should be doing things differently. And one thing that they don't do very often is try to look at how we can actually make things better. So I've always tried to approach this subject from a position of empowerment rather than victimhood, because part of the problem that we have is that everybody wants to make Native people victims constantly. Because as soon as we start talking about empowerment and moving forward, people get uncomfortable. And I think part of the reason they get uncomfortable is because they are aware of the history here. They're aware that, some really horrific things were done to Native people, and that somehow, some way, a different group, rather than the people that were here originally, have obtained control. So it makes people uncomfortable, I think, sometimes to talk about history and to talk about the things that actually happened. Now, the residential school system, if you were to take, the government at their face value word, was supposed to help, move us forward. It was supposed to help educate us. It was supposed to give us the skills that we needed to survive in the world that was coming, rather than the world that we were living in. Now, here's the problem I have with that statement, and it's really simple. The government had a lot of different opportunities and a lot of different programs in order to make this happen. In Saskatchewan, around the turn of the century, so we're talking the late 1800s, the Canadian government had a program to teach Indians how to farm. So what they did was they sent agricultural experts to the reserves in southern Saskatchewan, and they showed these people how to use modern equipment and how to farm. And the whole idea was to make the natives self-sufficient. It was supposed to help Ottawa by making it so that they wouldn't have to send money, basically to feed them. It was literally to teach them self-sufficiency. But there was a problem. The Indians got too good at it. So they were given equipment, they were given training, they were shown how to farm, and then the local farmers complained because suddenly they would take their food to market and they had to compete with the Native people who were doing very well. So their whole problem was, well, the government gave those people the equipment and they gave them all this training. They even buy them the seeds. How can we compete with that? Now, if you look at it from their point of view, I guess you could say that, yeah, they had a legitimate point that you can't compete with somebody that's being subsidized. But when you look at it from the Native people's point of view, all of Saskatchewan was our land. So the people that were living there were kind of living there, at our sufferance, I guess you could say. But now here's the problem. The government, rather than, doing what was right, the government decided, oh, you know what? You're right. That's not fair. So they went to the reserves. They took all the equipment, all the modern equipment, and took it away. And then they told the Indians, okay, so you guys are going to have to farm using your traditional methods, leaving aside the fact that the native tribes in Saskatchewan had never been farmers. They weren't an agricultural people. There was no such thing as traditional farming methods for them. So they took away all the modern equipment. All the training was for nothing. And you ended up with a bunch of people who were dependent on the government. Now, that's only one aspect of what we're talking about. We're talking about several different things that were systematic. Like, the system was designed to create a dependency of Native people on the government. Now, the residential schools, now this is the interesting part about all this, they were an attempt to educate Native people, but also to whitewash us. And if you read a lot of the quotes from the major government people at the time, they were filled with the sentiment, remove the Indian, save the child, right? So basically they were trying to teach us how to be brown-skinned white people. And what they would do is they would come to the reserves, and they would come to Métis settlements, they would come to small communities of Native people, and they would take all the children who were of school age. Now, they sometimes took children as young as 4 years old, because a lot of these people were paid by the government, and they were paid by the head. So if they couldn't find enough 6-year-olds, they would grab a few 4 and 5-year-olds. Now, who's going to say how old these kids are? Because a lot of Native people didn't have birth certificates, obviously. If you're born in the bush and not in a hospital, you might not even know what your real actual birthday is. The problem that I have with the way that everything was done isn't that they were trying to attempt to educate us, because anybody in the modern day knows education is power, knowledge is power, and education leads to knowledge. So I have no problem with being educated. I have a big problem with being forcefully educated in a system that is actually highly damaging for young people. Now, if you look at how Native people rear their young, traditionally, we were raised by our elders. So as a child, I spent a lot more time actually with my grandmothers than I ever spent with my mom and dad, because my mom and dad would be at work, and during the day they would leave me with one of my grandmas or my aunties, and they would teach me things. Now that's normal. That's a normal thing in Indigenous societies all around the world, but in particular Canada. Native people, we spent a lot of time with our elders. Now here's the scariest part of all of this. The elders are the ones that were the knowledge transmitters. They were the teachers. My generation of elders is from the first generations of the residential schools. So when they took those children, they didn't get the chance to learn from their elders. So when they came home, most of them didn't even speak the same language as their grandparents anymore. Because when you're taken away at the age of 5 or 6, and you're forced to speak English or French, and you're not allowed to speak your own language, when you go home, not only are you suddenly a stranger in a strange land, but you have no way of communicating with your elders anymore. So even if they wanted to teach you, they couldn't. So now my generation is really starting to see this, because a couple of years ago, I decided to quit being Christian. I decided I was going to relearn my Indigenous language. I was going to relearn my Indigenous spirituality. I talked lots about decolonization, but I didn't really do it. So I just decided, you know what? I'm not going to be a hypocrite. I'm going to do this. I'm going to learn how to speak Cree. I'm going to learn what my people's traditions really are. And I struggled. I struggled mightily to try and find an actual Cree elder who could transmit those things honestly. The first 3 elders that I visited, the sad thing is, they not only did they not know a lot of the traditional stuff, they were ashamed to admit that they didn't know it. They didn't want to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the stuff that they knew about being Indian wasn't real. It was fake. And so it's really difficult when you yourself are struggling and trying to reestablish your Indigenous identity, and you're being taught by people who don't know it themselves. And so I finally was lucky enough to meet an elder from Peerless Lake. Now, Peerless Lake is a community of Cree people that never met white people until the 1970s. So they were in a very remote area, in northern Alberta, and they actually had no contact with white people. So when I would talk to him, all of a sudden, the traditional stuff that I was learning was so different from the stuff that I was learning from the people who had been through residential school, that finally one day I asked him and I said, like, come on, like, what's going on here? Because all the stuff you're telling me makes sense, but it's so different from the other things that I've been taught. He taught me that women are supposed to be the knowledge keepers. Women are supposed to be the caregivers. That's their role in our society traditionally. And I would constantly ask him, like, okay, because that doesn't sound like the other stuff that I've been taught. Finally, he said to me, he said, Ryan, you have to quit trying to be Cree for the white man. He said, you have to be Cree for the Cree. You have to understand that you need to see yourself as a Cree person before you can be a Cree person. You can't see yourself as a Cree person when you still are white. And I struggled with that. I really did, because I was kind of thinking to myself, you don't have the right to tell me that I'm not Cree. Like, are you kidding me? And then I thought to myself, he's really not wrong, because he's looking at the world through a Cree lens. And he sees me still struggling to become Cree when I should be Cree naturally. That's who I am. That's my birthright. But the problem was that I'd been so colonized that I still saw myself through a white person lens, and I couldn't shake that for a long time. And I think that gives me a little bit more empathy when I'm studying these things, and when I'm learning about all these different modalities where colonizers or the people in power have basically taken minorities and tried to force them to be more like the mainstream. I think it's also one of the reasons why, my whole life I've been somebody that swims against the stream. I go against the grain, because I don't want to just do what other people tell me. And I think that one of the things that I've really learned a lot from being around the Jewish community and having so many Jewish friends is that, there's nothing wrong with being different. And there's nothing wrong with trying to be authentic and trying to be who you are, rather than just going along to get along. And, the more I looked into Jewish history, the more I realized, how much there was to learn from that. I mean, the Jews have always been a people. Name Nation of Israel comes from a guy that tried to wrestle with God. I mean, who wrestles with God? Who argues with the Creator? You just don't do that in our culture. But then I thought to myself, I mean, there's a lot to learn from that, because if the Creator's telling you to do something bad, don't do it. And like that's so my whole life now I've been trying to figure out, how do I build bridges? How do I learn from people who have valid things to teach? And it's interesting too, because like the idea of residential schools, it was just such a bad idea to take children away from their community and put them in these boarding schools to teach them. How much better would it have been to send teachers to small remote communities to teach them in their own community, so they can stay with their families, they can stay in their community, they can maintain speaking their own language while learning another language. I mean, I look at my own experience with residential school and how much I disliked being far away from my friends, far away from my family. I'd be gone all week, and then the only time I'd get to see my family was on the weekend. And I remember thinking to myself how brutal that must have been for kids, that because I spoke English. I mean, I was lucky. When I was small, I spoke Cree, like when I was a small child, but we spoke English in the house. And in my mother's house, we spoke English and French. So I was always able to communicate. I honestly couldn't imagine being a 5-year-old taken away from your home, not being able to communicate at all, put into some weird foreign place where there's people in weird clothes yelling at you all the time and punishing you if you spoke your own language. I honestly, like, it hurts my heart to even think of a child going through that. I mean, just the sheer trauma of that. And then you add in that some of those places were horrifically abusive. I'm not saying all of them were, but like Ira said, I mean, when you put people in these situations where it's, people with power and people with no power, that's a recipe for disaster. There's almost always going to be some sort of abuse. And when you add in the extra factor that a lot of white people had a very strong animus towards Native people, is a nice way to say it, I believe, because they had this idea that Native people weren't really human. We weren't, we're not the same. And that's an othering kind of thing. And you see that throughout history, that if you have a group of people that you don't think are quite as human as you are, that empowers you to do whatever you want. One of those things obviously is to teach us to be less Indian, and then we'll be more white, and then everything will be good. But at the same time, you don't want us to be too white, because we shouldn't be allowed to be too white, because we're not white. So we should be able to get to close to the apex of the pyramid, but they never let us near the top. And again, something I learned from Jews, because I mean, Jews have been very successful in a lot of the societies they've been in, but every time they approach the apex of that pyramid, something happens, they get knocked back down again. And then it just reminds them that, hey, as much as you might be like everybody else, you will never be like everybody else. So I guess that, like when I look at these things, I really see a lot of commonalities. I mean, obviously there are some big differences. I mean, the Cantonist system wasn't specifically directed at Jews. It just impacted Jews on a really large percentage. Whereas residential schools obviously were directed at Native people. They didn't have non-Native people in residential schools. It just didn't happen. But yeah, I guess like when we look at it through that lens, when we actually try to look at the similarities, and we realize like one of the things I talk about Jewish people is that you are an ethno-religious tribal people. Now, a lot of times people get really offended by that, but they don't understand that being an ethno-religious tribal person is not a bad thing. It means that your spirituality is intertwined with your ethnicity. It's part of who you are. So if you ask a Cree person, what religion are you? If they haven't been converted to Christianity, they'll just kind of look at you funny and they'll be like, well, I'm Cree, right? Like they don't know what to, like, what do you say? Like, they don't say I'm a monotheist. They don't say I'm a pantheist. They say I'm Cree, because being Cree, that's part and parcel of being Cree. And it's the same thing with Jews. Like if I was to say to a Jewish person, what religion are you? Unless they've been converted to something else, they're gonna be like, they'll look at me like I'm an alien. They'll be like, well, I'm a Jew, right? Like it's because it's so natural for them to understand that, because that is who you are. You're an ethno-religious tribal person. But in the modern day, we're not allowed to talk about tribalism, because tribalism is too much like nationalism, and all those isms are real bad. And we're not allowed to talk about, spirituality. Like I have some Jewish friends that get really upset at me when I say it's ethno-religious, because they're like, well, I'm not religious and I'm still Jew. And I'm like, I wasn't religious for a long time, but I was still Cree. That's not the point. The point is that there are aspects of my identity that I can only access if I know my traditions, if I know my spirituality. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that Cree people that are Christian suddenly aren't Cree. It just means that there's probably some aspects of their identity that they're unable to access. So anyway, that's my little spiel.
Okay, great. I think it's very interesting, Ryan. You're giving us a very personal experience, and you're teaching us from the personal outward. And Ira is much more an objective sort of historian's look. I'm sort of wondering, Ira, are there diaries of children who, that we know exactly? Like, I'd love to know a little bit of more from the inside, how children experienced, as I'm getting from Ryan. So I wonder if and then I'm going to let you two talk to each other.
You're muted, Ira.
Well, here's the thing. You have uprooted children from their families and their communities, and the uprooting was also a sort of intra-communal violence, because sometimes in order to get quotas for, they employed people who used kidnapping. Now, with all of this trauma, there are very, very few autobiographies of these people. These people were ordinary people as a general rule, and they stayed ordinary people, and if they were literate, it did not extend to the writing of autobiographies. What we have is, however, a very rich corpus of stories. And the stories, once again, feed the historical memory of Jews. This is what they did to us. This is how they took us away from our home. Here is how we were made to traverse thousands of kilometers on foot under adverse conditions. And it's all true. But what you have actually are Russian military records, which show that when contingents of Cantonists actually arrive at their place, a large percentage of the children had to be sent to hospital. How many survived? Not everybody survived the trip. Not everybody survived the hospitalization. The ones that did survive, well, they were under, they were under considerable pressure to learn Russian, they were at times under considerable pressure to abandon Judaism, though, as I said, not always and not consistently. But with all of these pressures, children survived. Many of the children survived to adulthood, and many of the adults, those who survived to adulthood, survived their period in the Russian army. And we find them in historical records, and we find them in stories that circulated among Russian Jews. Because, once again, Cantonist stories circulated among Russian Jews, talking about beatings, talking about the violence of being uprooted, talking about pressure to adopt Christianity, but no autobiographies, or hardly any as such.
Ryan, I understood that children in the residential schools did go home in the summers and various times during the year if they weren't too far away. And so I wonder, I had not heard that I understood that the children did speak their own languages outside of school hours, and that they didn't entirely lose their language. That was my understanding, but they weren't there all the time. They weren't there all the time. There were holidays, right?
It depends on the school. Like that was, see, the thing with the residential school system, and this is one of the reasons I think a lot of people hesitate to speak about it, because you can really only speak from the experience of the locals. St. Henry's in Fort Vermilion didn't have a lot of kids from the Fort Vermilion area. They would send kids from like Sampson, Hobbema, Alexis, like the central Alberta kids would get sent to the far north. The far north kids would get sent to the south. So the thing is, if they were close by, then sometimes they would let the kids go home for holidays like Christmas but the reality is a lot of them, especially the really religious schools, they didn't let the kids go home. So there's a lot of talk about it, but the truth is when you start digging in, the more religious the school, the less likely they were to let the kids go home. And the really religious schools, they really didn't let the kids speak their own language. Like I heard from my aunts like a family story, and like I don't like telling family stories because they're not really authoritative, but like knowing this part of my own family history is something that, you know, kind of motivated me to learn more about residential schools. My dad would speak Cree, and he was a stubborn kid. Like he was, you know, there's a little bit of familial thing there. My dad was really stubborn, and he was not a very easily he wasn't easily disciplined. Like he was already a pretty big child, and he was, you know, and he would speak Cree, and the brothers and the fathers, because that's they were priests and monks. What they would do is they would have one of them hold his tongue out, and the other one would close those old spring mouse traps on his tongue if he spoke Cree. They would make them kneel. They would pour dried beans and dried rice on the floor, and they would make the kids that kept speaking Cree kneel on those, and then say the Hail Mary and say like do the whole rosary. I mean, some of the stuff that I've heard, and it's not like he's got the most horrific stories. I've heard a lot of stories like that from residential school survivors. When I was taking testimonies for the TRC, when I was in university, it was the original reconciliation committee, and they had us interviewing residential school survivors. Now, some of the stories we would hear, you know, you don't want to, but you kind of dismiss them because they're like, okay, that's a little too much. Like, you know, people telling me that 7-year-olds got pregnant and stuff like that. You kind of, you know, but a lot of these people, some of the stuff that they would tell you, you know, that it's very difficult to put it into words, because they're telling you about, like, imagine having to listen to someone telling you about the worst day of their life over and over and over, right? And that's why, like, for me, it got to the point where I wouldn't say I was cynical, but I would have to have somebody give me a lot, like what you just said, you know, like I'd have to hear directly from them, because I always thought too, you know, didn't they send them home at Christmas, you know, like, because it's a residential school. And in my residential school, the one I attended, St. Mary's, we got to go home on the weekend. We got to go home for holidays. We were just there during the week. But I mean, you have to remember that was in the 1990s. So that's well after all of the really documented abuses. In the 70s and 80s was when it really started to change. But in the 50s and 60s, it was still really bad. Like, it was still, you have to remember, like, if you're not really, like, in the age of social media, all somebody has to do is put a post up and everyone knows what's happening. In those days, if you didn't have some sort of forum and you didn't have some sort of loud platform, nothing you said mattered. So, like, imagine you're a Native kid and you got sent home for the weekend, if you were lucky enough to go home, and you could tell everybody that the priests are doing really horrible things, but who's going to believe you? And even if they believe you, the parents could go to jail if they kept you away from school. Because according to Canadian law in the 1960s and 70s, we didn't just have the reserve pass, which was you had to get a pass from the local Indian agent in order to leave the reserve, but you also had to get permission for anything. Anything you did as a Native person, you needed permission from the Indian agent. So if you tried to keep your kid from going back to school, I guarantee you the RCMP would have been at your house that day, taking you forcefully back to school, and your parents would probably get thrown in jail. So it's really
Okay, I mean,
different.
I think the figure is something like 30%, only about 30% of Indigenous children did go to the residential schools. So we've never really done an outcomes kind of controlled outcomes study of outcomes for children that went to residential school and outcomes for children that didn't go to residential school. I know that often the residential school children's outcomes or disease rates or whatever are compared to the general population, but I'm not sure that's a fair comparison because it doesn't, you know, especially
it makes sense. Look, like, if you're going to look at, like, exactly, like, if you talk about outcomes, like, here's a big problem, right? Do you compare a kid who has absolutely no chance of getting an education, because most of the reserve schools were actually quite terrible? I mean, I was blessed, and I'm going to be blunt. My family reads, right? My mom was a teacher, so I didn't have to struggle like a lot of the kids in my community. Like, if you were to go around Paddle Prairie even today and go to my generation, you can see the difference. Now, the scary part is somebody might point to me and say, well, see, Ryan went to a residential school and, you know, like, he turned out okay. and then they use me, and I don't like it. They use me as a success story, but the real truth of the matter was I was lucky in so many different ways, right? And you make a very good point, because now what happens if you grab another kid that didn't go to any of those schools, but he also didn't get much of an education? How much ability is he going to display in living in the modern world, in finding employment? And it is really, it's a difficult situation, because like you said, it's very nuanced. I mean, do we say that because there were enough kids who didn't get abused and managed to survive and made it through the whole thing, and now they have decent lives? Like, do we say that, was that worth it? Like, was it worth the 2,000 or some odd kids that died? Like, it because I mean, this is a tough conversation, and it is really uncomfortable for a lot of people, me included.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you two should be talking to each other, not so much about, I don't think it's a very productive thing myself to say things like, was it worth it? That's a question that's impossible to answer. But I think what you two might be discussing is how did people cope with these memories? Like, it happened, history happened, these schools happened. So we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma. Ira, you're telling me there's no autobiographical information, but I really would like to get you two talking about the commonalities, but also the differences, and maybe.
I have a question for Ira, because I mean, it's weird to me that there isn't like a lot more writing, because I mean, that's one thing that I've always really respected about the Jewish people, is that you document everything, right? Like, and there's always somebody writing like a firsthand account of almost everything, like even when you go right back to the Jews in Egypt. So it's strange
Well,
to me that they didn't really write
yeah.
much about it.
There's a sense that I get that it was too painful an experience to really write about. The pain was channeled not through individual autobiographies, because once again, I think the pain was too great. I think that the thing got circulated through stories. People didn't write, "Here is my life." People told stories, and the stories circulated. Now, can you document all these stories? No, you can't. But in the aggregate, they paint a picture. And the picture is one where the community itself felt a large sense of guilt, survivor's guilt, if you will, because the Russian government, the Tsarist government, made Jewish communities responsible for supplying recruits. So they say, okay, you guys, go choose. It's your community. You give us X number of boys or young men, and then the question is, who goes, who doesn't go? The answer was boys from poor families disproportionately went, as opposed to boys with families of means. And we can certainly understand how this happened, but what that did within Russian Jewish communities in the mid-19th century was create rifts between the poor and the rich, to create internal communal mistrust between poor people and rich people. Now, there's always some tension in communities between the rich and the poor, but this exacerbated it tremendously. So the Russians, as I said, had their reasons. The Tsar needed an army. And the Tsar understood, I need to just take people in my army. And this is how they did it. This is the system that was put into place and that remained in place through the Crimean War of the 1850s. Jews have, as you know, the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible supplies them with images and ideas, and and current events were and are often subsumed into the categories of the Hebrew Bible. So, why do you have to talk about the details of this new oppression? Well, Jews have been oppressed for thousands of years new. Why write about this particular thing? As it's not as surprising as you might think, Ryan.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me. I think that, like, what I think about the Cantonist system, like, the one thing that kind of is weird to me is, like, in our culture, like my family especially, it's a little bit more militaristic. So, like, for us, you'll notice that there is a large number of Native Canadians who joined the Canadian Army. And
Oh, yes.
I know it's counterintuitive because you don't, I mean, it's like, fighting the white man's war. But the truth of the matter is, like, my own great uncle, one of my great uncles passed away in Italy, and the other one went to shore at Juno Beach. So, I mean, like, to us, joining the army wasn't such a bad thing. But I guess, one, they weren't making them join for 25 years, and two, I would imagine that the Tsar's army was probably a little crappier than serving in Her Majesty's Royal Forces. So
It was
thing.
considerably crappier. That's for sure. And remember that the army in other, in Canada or the United States or Great Britain has its hierarchies and has its injustices. Nonetheless, theoretically speaking, anybody can become anything. In theory, in reality, less so. But in theory, anybody can enter the ranks and wind up as an officer.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a meritocracy.
It's supposed to, it is it's not necessarily consistently, but it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
In the Russian army, it was absolutely out of the question for Jews to become officers. You could, if you were, if you remain Jewish, you could be an NCO. You could get to be let's say a sergeant or something, but you couldn't get into the ranks of the officers. No way, no how. That was reserved for Christians. So so they're entering a society that even in theory is no meritocracy. They are there as servants of the Tsar. Their official, the Cantonists' official legal designation. They were serfs of military settlements. A serf, remember, before the serfs were emancipated in the 1860s, they were, they were somewhere and they were required to be there. They couldn't leave where they were. This is where they were, and this is how it was. And they were under, they were under what amounted to be military discipline. And you had 8-year-old boys and up under military discipline, knowing that the only way that they would ever advance in this system would be as a Christian. And yet the record shows that not merely did most of these boys resist baptism, but there are numerous cases in the Russian archives of Cantonists who did become Christians, survived their military service, and then petitioned to revert to Judaism. And this took guts because reversion to Judaism was literally in Russia until the 1870s a crime.
If you don't mind, I'm going to, there's some questions building up from our listeners, and we could still continue in dialogue, but I think I'll introduce some of these questions because there's enough that I don't want us to be leaving people out. So let's start with some of the questions. One of the questions is, did the children, this was to Ira, did the children ever see their parents again? How did they retain their Jewish identity? And did they integrate into Christian Russian society?
Okay. They never saw their parents again. The Russian archives are full of petitions from parents asking to be allowed to see their children. They were routinely denied. And how did they maintain their Judaism, assuming that they wished to resist? And the answer is that often they were aided by Jewish soldiers in the army, because whereas the religious expression of Jewishness among the Cantonists was discouraged and forbidden, it was not forbidden to be a Jew in the Russian army. So there were, if there was a regiment billeted near the Cantonist school, Jewish soldiers might well befriend these Cantonist children and encourage them to resist baptism. And there are records, there are records of Russian Jewish military societies there, where they actually constituted a sort of congregation. At least one of them bought a Torah scroll for itself. So these are, the Russian army was a very strange, somewhat bipolar entity. Jews were given facilities to pray when it didn't interfere with maneuvers or whatever. But on the other hand, there was this pressure to become Russian Orthodox. And of course, not merely for Jewish children, Catholic children from Poland, Cantonists, were also subjected to pressures to become Orthodox rather than Catholic.
Okay. Ryan, there's a question about decolonization. How can Jews and First Nations decolonize? Is that something that is, I guess, possible? But we're hearing a lot about decolonization in the universities. We have land acknowledgements every time, which some people kind of find, sometimes they're very long land acknowledgements. One of my own interests is decolonization in the university by setting up parallel streams of knowledge as if there's parity, like say Indigenous science or white science, which I'd like to know your views on. But you could take the question generally. How are we going to decolonize? Can we? But I'd like you to get into the weeds a little bit on.
Sure.
Okay.
It's super simple. You need to learn to see yourselves as Jews through a Jewish lens. And it's the same thing with Native people. We need to see ourselves through our own people's lens. So if you're Cree, you need to see yourself as a Cree person through a Cree lens. You can't go through life seeing yourself as Cree through a white man's lens. I mean, when you look, and I know I use the term white man a lot. I don't mean it like in a, I know it's a very loaded term nowadays, but you have to remember where I grew up, you're either a white man or you're an Indian. This is the way it is. My mom was white. So, I mean, I'm not racist against white people. I just use this term because it's an easy term. When I talk about being Cree, it took me a long time. I struggled because you have to remember all of the media that I've seen my entire life is the white man's media. All of the books I've read, they were books that in my, language itself is the white man's language. The books I read were white man's books. There were no Cree books. We didn't have Cree as a written language. So everything that I knew about being Cree came from white people. So how was I ever going to see myself as Cree through a Cree lens? It was impossible. I mean, I've written extensively on how my dad used to cheer for the Indians in cowboy and Indian movies. And when I was a little kid, this just offended me. I was like, Merv, what the hell? You're cheering for the bad guys. And he would laugh and be like, no, I'm cheering for our people. And, when you're a little kid, you don't see it that way because, you watch a cowboy and Indian movie and John Wayne is the hero, right? And now when you actually watch them, when you get a little bit older and you start realizing, wait a second, like the portrayal of Native people maybe isn't that accurate. I mean, you suddenly start to realize, wait a second, some of the stuff that I've been taught is not really the way things are. And I noticed.
I'm sorry. I think the question I really wanted to ask was, although that's very interesting what you're saying, I think the real question I wanted to ask was reconciliation, which we're supposed to be in the process of here in Canada. I like looking at it as a Jew. When I think about reconciliation of, say, the most terrible things that ever happened to us, like the Holocaust, you don't have antagonism towards, towards, say, third generation Germans that you meet. You don't meet a German and feel, what your grandparents did to my grandparents, generation. You don't do that. But I get the feeling that in the reconciliation process that we've been subjected to, in a sense, that there is a great deal of hostility. We're not. It's like our generation didn't do all this stuff, and the people that are still very angry are in general quite young people who also they're angry on their grandparents' behalf, not their own behalf. So, and I find that the language
I would actually, Barb, sorry, I have to cut you off there just because I disagree, right? Because see,
okay.
you said my generation. Now, I'm not. I don't want to put anybody in an age box here, but I will say this: the last residential school closed in 1994. So there are people that did suffer from those that are younger and still pretty upset about it. I do agree with you though that it's definitely generational. Like my grandmother, sorry, my great grandmother on my mother's side was Norwegian, and her village was wiped out because they helped smuggle the gold from the Norwegian treasury out of Norway when the Nazis were trying to find the gold. There's like a whole story written about it. They basically massacred almost the entire village. They killed like 125 people or something. They killed them all. So my grandmother, my great grandmother, sorry, whenever you would mention anything about Germans, and I remember this very clearly as a child, she would get really, really upset. And like she her whole life, she never had any kind words or feelings towards any Germans, right? My grandmother, who was obviously a little girl, she still had a lot of animus towards Germans, but she kind of, as she got older, she got over that. My mother, still, there was a little bit of animosity towards Germans, and me, I didn't, because I didn't have that direct experience. Now, with residential schools, there are still children that are directly impacted by that. There are kids whose parents were in residential school, and their parents were so messed up that their experiences and the trauma that they've gone through from those schools really makes it difficult for them to separate from this. So when we talk about truth and reconciliation, the problem has always been that it's one thing to say sorry. It's another thing to say sorry and then try to actually, like what we've talked about this, to say sorry and then try to find something that you can do to actually to help change the circumstances. Anybody can say sorry. I mean, you get Trudeau, he gets up on a stage and he's got the tear and he talks about Indigenous water every election. I mean, we've quit paying attention to that now. Like, and the land acknowledgements, that's like me going to you and saying, hey, is it okay if I take a dump in your living room? Because, but as long as I acknowledge that it's your living room, hey, is it okay if I do that? Like, to Native people, we're like, wait a second, you're thanking us for stealing our stuff. Like, that's insulting. And
I agree. I don't
done.
I don't have much use for them. But let's talk about the Prime Minister for a minute, because our Prime Minister says that not only was a genocide committed during all these years, but that we're still in the midst of an ongoing, and we're all complicit in it. And these words have meanings. This word genocide is tossed around quite freely. It's not just tossed around. There's a concerted effort to actually
they want to make you feel ashamed. They want to make the average Canadian feel ashamed.
No, but I mean, they want to legally entrench this word. And they also, from what I can see, they would like to perhaps start us down the road to a kind of criminalization of what they call genocide denialism. The Minister of Crown and Aboriginal Relations has called it.
I'd be guilty of it. I would be guilty of under their terms.
You would be guilty of denialism, and so would I. But it's actually not. It's actually a little unnerving when scholars who are honestly trying to get to the truth of things are called denialists by the Minister for the Crown and Aboriginal Relations, and when they cannot get their work published in mainstream media, they have to go to True North. Or
we've gone through this. Like the problem is that when we went through this before, when it was people denying the Holocaust, there's a big difference between denial and actually investigation, right? All those people that used to use the free speech and academic freedom when they would talk about the Holocaust, there's a very different thing, because when they would talk about the Holocaust, those were people that they already had their conclusions before they started their investigations. When we're talking about like Native stuff, and in Canada, I get really nervous because, look, I've said this, I'll go on the record as saying it again. We're not going through an ongoing genocide right now. That's nonsense. And when people say stuff like that, it offends me. we are experiencing the echoes of genocidal policies. I mean, those genocidal in like the 1800s, but
When you
I would
use,
not say that we are going through a genocide now.
all right, so when you use the word genocide, do you believe that the intent of the Canadian government was literally to exterminate?
It's tough to ascribe intent. Like that's a really tough one, especially like if you're going to basically treat every discussion as a court of law, which I try to do. But the truth of the matter is, when you look at what they were doing, when you look at what they did, what they said in a totality, when you look at this, I don't really look at this as Canada versus Native people. I look at this, honest to goodness, as white people, like what we call white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Really, they were the whatever you want to call it, the majority. We look at it as white culture versus us, and the reason we look at it that way is because we were always seen as an impediment. So when you look at treaties, especially when you really look at the language, American treaties are surrender documents. There's no bones about it. When you read an American treaty, it's flat out, you lost, we're taking this, and this is all in writing, like it or love it or lump it. It's just the way it is. With the British treaties with Native people, you see it all in almost all the Canadian treaties, very flowery language, talking about partnerships and building the future together. But when you really, really look at it, they're surrender documents as well. They're just much more flowery. So it's difficult because now, would I say that every Canadian government minister that ever had anything to do with Natives wanted us all to be dead? No. But did they see us as an impediment to resource extraction? Absolutely. Did they think that by putting us on reserves and starving us, that it was going to lead to any kind of good outcome for us? Obviously not. Now, were there other people, and these are Canadian government people as well, who tried to mitigate that? Were there people who actually did have our best interests at heart? Absolutely. Historically, you can find a lot of different Canadian politicians that spoke up against how Indians were being treated. I mean, it was a white politician in the 1930s. I can't remember his name right now, but he was the first one to say Native people should be allowed to have guns. Because until the 1930s, it was illegal for a Native Canadian to own a gun, to own a firearm. So, I mean, these are historical things.
Okay, so let me ask you, just to bring it back to the Jews and their experience. It seems to me that the Jews, these kids that were, in the Cantonist system, was terrible, horrible, I'm sure very traumatic and all that. But it's interesting that it's not something that, I mean, apparently they after they did survive, or their children or their grandchildren made new lives somewhere, or they emigrated to Israel. The stories I've never heard, the lamentation part is not ongoing in Jewish life, from what I can see, about episodes like this, or eras of history. So I and in terms of denial, the Holocaust can't be denied because the evidence is all there. The trouble I find with the reconciliation process is much of it is based on oral history, and
Too much.
oral history is stories. And yet we have to be guided by these stories. And the stories are, as you say, they're a mixed bag. You talked about being put on reserves. How do you see the Jews had Zionism? They had a very prescribed territory. After 3,000 years, got it back, and you see that as a miraculous story, and we see it as a miraculous story. What would be a miraculous story for Indigenous peoples in Canada? Because I don't know what the end game, what is the end game of all this going to be that would be a happy ending for Indigenous people?
I think for most of us now, like, we understand that there's simply too many people here to have the same kind of story as the Jews, right? As much as people don't like to admit this, when the Jews made their return to Israel, when they rejoined the Jews that had never left, there was still a very small population we look at it now, it's obviously geographically, it's a tiny country, but I mean, it was a tiny population in a tiny country. And then that's when the beginning of the Aliyahs happened in the 1800s, right? So then you had to return to your ancestral land. Then you slowly managed to achieve self-determination. Now, we are never going to achieve national self-determination. I understand that. What we can do, though, is we can start building into what actually is written in the treaties. And there's a reason why so many Native people see the treaties almost as sacred documents. And they get really upset if you denigrate the treaties. But the truth is, when you read them, they talk about partnerships. They talk about moving forward, building something together. That was always, to us, the plan. We never wanted to get rid of white people. I mean, that's a very modern take on things, that suddenly the Indians wanted to kill all the whites and take everything back. And you have these people who talk about land back, and they don't ever really explain what land back even means. What it means to me is, it means that we should have the ability to have, like, to perpetuate our people, to perpetuate our culture and our language. I should not have to walk around saying I'm Canadian and I have to follow all of Canada's laws. Yeah, okay, if I'm going to be a Canadian citizen, fine. But then that means I should have all the rights and obligations of any other Canadian citizen. That means that I should not have anything special. Now, until we, get rid of some of the inequalities, I don't want to talk about equality of outcome. I'm not talking about that. Equality of opportunity is paramount. Equality of outcome can never be guaranteed. And it's actually, I think, more damaging to try and guarantee outcomes. I think what we need to do is we need to talk to Native people. We need to make sure that Native people are actually consulted. And I'm going through this right now with my own local government. We have non-Métis people running the Métis settlement. Why? Because they're treaty Indians. So they're not technically Métis. They took treaty. So they can always leave and go back to their reserves. So if they screw up really badly here in Paddle, we lose our settlement. It doesn't impact them. They can move to a reserve. I can't move to a reserve because I'm not a treaty Indian. So that's literally what we're talking about here. Is so what is the way forward? Well, the way forward is each Native group should have some sort of participatory power in the government. And it should be real participatory power, not, like this garbage with Trudeau and his, oh, well, we'll give the Indians a little bit to keep them happy and that's it. It needs to be something real. It needs to be tangible, because the truth of the matter is most Native people don't want to participate in modern society. They don't. They would be perfectly happy to stay in their reserves, to stay on their Métis settlements, to stay in their little communities. Why? Because being involved in life is difficult. It's not easy. And it's a very difficult thing to take somebody. We talk about this all the time. Comfort is the enemy of identity. And if they become comfortable hiding away, they'll stay hidden away. And the problem with that is then nobody knows we exist.
I think this, my question was too big.
It's a big question.
I think it is too big. And we could talk about the reserve system, whether it's ultimately.
It's tough, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's it. Like, because then if we talk about reserves, then we have to talk about the fact that almost no reserves are on people's ancestral land. So like the Cree from central Alberta were pushed north into northern Alberta. The Blackfoot from central Alberta were pushed south into southern Alberta. And then they wanted to make their reserves side by side, but the government said, no. That'd be dangerous to have the Indians too close together, right? So yeah, like it's such a huge thing. Like I don't like the idea of Native people being hidden away on reserves. I'm a big advocate of being visible. I think that if the only Indians you ever see are the drunk people downtown who harass you, you're going to think that that's Native people. But you don't see the people that are working and volunteering and coaching children's teams. Why? Because they're busy doing those things.
I guess the real question is, we started with children, children whose lives were changed without their consent, without their torn away, that sort of thing. And that's a terrible thing to do to a child. But there's other terrible things to do to children too. And I think giving them no opportunity is also not great. And that was the problem. I think that is the issue for many right-thinking Canadians who really do want to see things improve for Indigenous people. but it's the thought of all these children who, in the name of their culture or their reserve or their, are not getting the same advantages as other Canadians are getting. And that's, I think, one of the big problems. I don't know. I think, Ira, would you like to wrap up some of your thoughts in relation to, I'm sorry, I've been talking more to Ryan because I think many of our listeners are not as up to speed on Indigenous issues as they are on Jewish history, but please jump back in and help me. We're going to have to wind up in a few minutes. So,
Okay. No, I think that it is a it was and remains a stain on Canada. And I remember in particular once the Canada voted against Iran for their violations of human rights, and the Iranians who were hopping mad at the Canadians knew exactly what to do. They sent Iranian journalists to Canada to document human rights abuses. Where did they send them? Immediately to First Nations reserves. Plenty of material. And so I think that there is so much that needs to be unpacked, and and unpacking all of this stuff, it gets very messy. Unpacking history gets messy, and in particular, unpacking historical memory, because once again, people remember things, whether, and if they happened a little bit differently, it doesn't matter to historical memory. The residential schools and the Cantonists will remain solidly in our historical memories. And historical memories are, for good or bad, how society thinks of things. There is a limit to, there's a limit on our ability to say, well, it didn't happen exactly this way, it didn't happen exactly that way. People know what they know. We can nudge a little bit this way or a little bit that way. Our power is to nudge, not to change. The historical memory of residential schools is going to loom large, as the historical memory of the Cantonists looms large among contemporary Jews. And even if you can show, well, there was this and there was that, and it was terrible in its own right. Both phenomena were terrible in their own right.
I think, sorry about the unmuting. I always forget. I think on that note, we're going to wrap it up. And I think we all agree that the questions are too big to deal with in 1 hour, but at least the questions are being asked. That's important. The dialogue continues. And I'm sure this won't be the last time this subject will be broached in a webinar. So thanks everybody for coming who are still with us. And thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ira, for dealing with.
Thank you, Barbara.
Well, my pleasure to be
and
here.
Nathan.
Thanks, Barb.
None of us would be here without Nathan. So thank
Nathan,
you, Nathan.
yes. Thank you, Nathan, for organizing all this, and look forward to more on the same vein before too long. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Good night.
Good night.